Right, well, while I'm waiting for the microphone, I could say I was kind of hoping that this room would have a massive panoramic window and it would be nice and fun, like it was yesterday, because I was going to make this point about, we can't see very far, because it's a very changeable landscape. And I thought that would be one of those easy to make, profound comments that I do. But sadly, it's we don't have any windows and it's much clearer than yesterday.
But we can't see very far because there's a brick wall.
Which is also a symbolic, slightly more in-your-face symbolism than I intended. I think that, but the general principle holds true. I should say good morgon and good morning to everyone here. This is quite a symbolic conference for me in some ways, because 15 years ago, I lived about an hour away in northern Stockholm, and I was a disgruntled citizen. I had quite a big interest in environmental issues, and at the time there were suggestions about building highways, new highway systems, and I was very much opposed. And I remember going to some of the public meetings that were held. And I remember being really, actually very angry about the way these meetings were held. Because it felt very top-down, it felt like a chance for you to stand up in front of a lot of people and just vent. Rows of chairs, a few disinterested politicians giving their pre-prepared speeches and responding to any questions with a kind of pre-formulated answer. So there was power in the room, but there was no participation. And then I got very active in the environmental movement, and there the problem was the opposite. The meetings were often very participative, and you could really have your say. There was no power in the room. So both meetings, in their own way, became talking shops. So that's where my interest in how the practicalities of making democracy work, that was actually forged not too far away from here. And then about 10 years ago, I went to London, originally to study, and then I got involved with Involve, which was being set up. I started doing a lot of work around citizen participation. And at that time, it wasn't a thing in Sweden. 10 years ago, I really didn't feel that medborgardialog as a concept existed. This was something completely uncharted, and we just didn't do it. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I started talking to people at Salar, and I realized that this was actually happening in Sweden as well. There was a lot of stuff in the UK, and Sweden was, the concept had appeared. And then late last year in December, I moved back to Malmö. So in a sense, this is sort of coming full circle. I can bring my experiences from the UK to bear in Sweden, and we can discuss. And having lived in both the UK and Sweden, I can perhaps look across. So I was originally going to put the bridge up there across Copenhagen, because I think this is really what this conference is all about. It's about everyone sharing their experiences across. But the bridge is also good as a symbol, and my God, I'm going on about symbols, aren't I? But I think symbols are a good way to start because they really resonate with us. That we are on a bridge at the moment, and it is very foggy, and we cannot see very far. And the reason it's very foggy is because of the convergence of many different trends and development. We are blessed and cursed to live at a time when so many trends, the demographic trends, the social trends, all the things that Lena mentioned yesterday, are converging. And being someone who likes to paint, I know that when you mix many different things, you tend to get mud and strange, unpredictable colors in the middle that can't really be classified. So that's why what we're talking about here. We are going to be talking today about the many different changes that are happening to society, many trends which outwardly have no bearing on democracy, but which actually change everything about how we are governed. And there is this general sense across Western democracy that there are problems with democracy. And it takes many different shapes and forms. And I'll talk about 3 trends that I think are particularly potent when it comes to shifting democracy. And that's trends when it comes to structures, trends when it comes to values, and trends when it comes to technologies. I can only scratch the surface, but just from speaking to the other speakers yesterday, I know that many of these themes will be discussed at great length. But I think there is this concept of post-democracy going around the academic world. The idea that, yes, democracy is one of the most widespread forms of government, but enthusiasm by which it's viewed is declining, and the general sense that it doesn't make any difference who I vote for. It's a managerial decision. It's the thing about, you vote for, I vote for different politicians, but government stays the same. That very cynical view, which is becoming increasingly widespread. So if we look at the first challenge, this says after party. When my dad joined a party in the 60s, it was because he lived in the countryside and they were the only people who organized any social activities for young people. So there were many reasons people joined parties in the past, but the fact is representative democracy, the concept is based on the fact that we have mass parties and that those mass parties in a meaningful way can channel the views of different parts of society, that regardless of who you are and what your values are, there is a party there to represent you. And as mass parties are becoming a thing of the past, that's becoming increasingly hard to justify. When party membership really dips low, how do parties demonstrate they're actually listening? In practice, what I think we're seeing around the world is an incredible political volatility. I'm thinking about Australia and Denmark and France, where political parties storm in to great success. They're very popular, and within just a year or two, there's general cynicism. There's a sense it hasn't made any difference. They're deeply unpopular, and new populist parties are given the opportunities. We're seeing the rise of these new parties and the collapse and fall. So it's a much more fragmented landscape. And that, in part, I think, is why people look to participation as a way to actually smooth the waves of an increasingly troubled sea. See, this was meant to be a nice bright red. It's a tomato, not a meteor hurtling at us. It's about deference. Our values have shifted. In the last 10 years, I've worked with so many different organizations.
What would you translate that to Swedish with?
Deference is underdådighet, or respect for authority. The kind of just being the belief that people in power know better. It's not my place to challenge. And the most telling is perhaps 100 years ago, in 1914, millions and millions of people marched out to war. Most of them didn't really have a clue what they were fighting for. Many of them probably didn't think it was a good idea, but the general consensus was the kings and politicians, they say and we follow. It's not my place to challenge. When I say unpopular war, many people think about the Vietnam War, but it took over 10 years of fighting on the ground before protests became a mass thing. Now cast your thoughts forward to the Iraq War, and before a single shot had been fired, we were seeing hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating against the war. I've been working with organizations from the Arts Council to big corporations like the Virgin Corporations to the Scouts movement, and they all say the same thing. We can't make the decisions we used to in the same way. We used to just be able to make a decision, and in the Swedish term, peka med hela handen, just say, this is how it's going to be. Doesn't work. The values have shifted. And so we're turning to participation as a way to deal with that values shift as well. And the third shift is the fact that we now have a situation where the majority of our citizens are walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket. We're in a situation where most of our citizens have easy access to all the information. And many of the arguments about why we can't involve citizens, they're too far away, we can't get them all in the room at the same time, they don't have the information, they wouldn't understand, that is all rapidly stripping away. And this is also placing an incredible power in the hand of ordinary citizens in terms of creating and disseminating a message. So it's a real power shift, and a power shift which centralized bureaucracies are really badly situated to tap into. I remember a few years ago, I went to one of the big UK departments and spoke to their head of social media. And I said, have you seen this site? And he said, no, because unfortunately, our firewall blocks any website with the word blog in it. And this is their head of social media. Now that was a few years ago and that's shifted, but it just shows the way that public administrations are often on the back foot when it comes to these trends. So these are three of the trends that I think are going to be really important. A shift in values, the decline in many of the traditional structures, and also the rise of new technology with all that it means. And I should say all of these have negatives as well, because of course the decline in deference, if that's not combined with increased trust and structures to incorporate these more autonomous individuals, what we're likely to see is more political chaos, more anger, more frustration. So all of this is actually about transition. It's really about, we are on that bridge, we are in that shift. And one thing we know about transitions is they're very dangerous. Democracies are generally the safest place to be in the world. Next are dictatorships. The most dangerous place to be is in a dictatorship which is becoming a democracy. We also know that the time in life when you're, one of the most dangerous times in life is when you're transitioning from childhood to an adult life. That's also a very difficult and dangerous time for young people. Transitions are difficult and dangerous, and I think I'd say that the teenage years of this century, the years we're in, are going to be a very troubling time for democracy around the world, because we're seeing all of these different trends converging. We're seeing all of these pressures put on democratic systems which haven't really had to change that much. On the plus side, we're seeing it's a great age to be alive because there's so much experimentation. We're going to see things develop that we can't guess at today. It's impossible to. And actually one of the key qualities that any civil servant or anyone can have around public participation is the ability to improvise. Because as soon as you start to think that engagement and participation and democracy is something that can be easily categorized and channeled, then you're in for some nasty surprises. I think I'm always wary about creating too strong a typology, but I think we can say something about the evolution of citizen dialogue and medborgardialog across the decades. In the 1990s, it was just about developing the methods and proving that, yes, these 20 citizens can say something useful about policy X. In the last decade, it was very much about scaling it up and was saying we can do this with 20 people on a local issue. Now let's see if we can do it with 1,000 or 5,000 or 8,000 people on a national or international issue. And while both of those battles still need to be fought, by no means does everyone believe this is a good idea, but we've got evidence now that we can do it at a larger scale. I think the challenge for the next decade is going to be to moving it from a project, from a pilot stage into business as usual. It's about making this a much more, it's to the point where actually we don't have to have conferences about it. It's that thing that people always say about e-democracy. Let's drop the E, let's make it just democracy. And when we don't have to talk about participative democracy, when this has become what it means to be democratic, then I think we've come a long way to deal with the issues. And I know this is something that Catherine is going to talk a little bit about, but one of the key challenges we have is because many people are like me 15 years ago, very disgruntled with the process, very not trusting the system at all, we have a problem in how we design participative democracy. We design it in a black box. Yes, you can come in and participate, but actually you don't have any say in how the system is structured. You don't know why are we meeting here? Why are we meeting in this format? Those key decisions are often made behind closed doors. And especially in very contentious areas, we're going to have to start designing participation in the same way that many companies design software. It's open. We release it in beta. We design it with people, and we're constantly iterating. This need to have a polished final product that we present to people is often the undoing of participation. I'd also add this about the need, why bad participation is worse than none at all. It's a bit like wells. My father worked in international development, and they built a lot of wells, and the temptation for international development corporations is always, it's nicer to build new wells than to maintain them. But actually for the villagers, having a bad well, a badly maintained well, is more dangerous than not having a well at all. And it actually leads to increased mistrust, because there you have a broken well on your square as a daily reminder of what the promise was. And that's exactly what happens when we open up and say, we're listening, and then we go ahead and do what we're going to do anyway. And this is my final point is really this thing about This is from Matt Leninger in the Deliberative Democracy Consortium in the States. It's one of his favorite. This is not actually his anecdote. It's a citizen's anecdote, which is relayed to me and I'm relaying to you. But an American citizen said that to a politician, what we have here is an adult-child relationship. You politicians take care of us citizens. What we need to have is an adult-adult relationship. We need to start sharing those difficult trade-offs, the converging trends, which means that actually being a politician today is often one of the hardest jobs. Being a civil servant is one of the hardest jobs. And if we try and shield citizens from the difficult trade-offs, if we don't involve them fully in co-production and engagement, then we have a very difficult job on our hands. And people behave generally the way you expect them to. If we expect people to behave like children, to be irrational and demanding and difficult, they'll probably be that way. So our challenge is really to take the relationship between state and citizen from adult-child to adult-adult. And that does mean going through that difficult teenage phase, which does mean a lot of challenging and rule-breaking and having to adapt. And no plan survives contact with a teenager. And we have a lot of teenagers here. So I think the picture here is of someone going up and getting an apple for someone versus actually lifting someone up on their shoulders and they get the apple. That's the direction we need to move on, I think, in terms of public engagement. So I think those are the general points I wanted to make starting out. I think it's very exciting to see that this is happening in Sweden. I think in many countries around the world there is a big pivotal moment when this breaks through into the mainstream. In the UK, arguably GM crops was one of those moments when it became very clear that you do engagement badly, it blows up in your face. I think in Germany, Stuttgart, the railway station, the conflict around that was a real eye-opener. And I don't think that Sweden has had that moment yet. I think citizen dialogue is happening, but it's not become a hot topic. But I think it will. And when that happens, I think it's extremely important that there are dedicated practitioners and civil servants and politicians who can ensure that that doesn't just become another buzzword, something that lots of people hitch their words to, but that doesn't actually end up meaning anything. So those are my remarks. Thank you for letting me start the process, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else says.
There was a couple of things actually that really leapt out of me in that presentation. And I guess one of them is this thing that's so obvious, that we can't just impose what we're doing on people, yet we do. The government is so paternalistic in so many ways, and they wonder then why the public doesn't accept that relationship, because you do react like you're being spoken to like a child, the parent telling you not to be naughty, and you've got to do it our way, and this is how it works. And yet it takes us by surprise when the public reacts like that. Gee, why? When we think of it that way, it's quite obvious. And there's another point in terms of just this idea of getting people involved in the process. I think some of the work that Martin and I have done, we've looked at this continuum that if all you do is ask the people you know, the only answers you ever get are the ones you already have. But if you open up the conversation to a whole load of other people, not only do you get a whole load of different answers, you get a whole load of different questions as well. So that's a really important thing. You're not just looking for the answers, you're looking for the process.